The wagon had stopped moving an hour ago, but Clara Winslow couldn't bring herself to climb down. Her hands were still wrapped around the reins, knuckles bone white, even though the mule had long since given up pulling. The animal stood with its head low, flanks heaving, and Clara sat frozen above it all like a statue carved from exhaustion and shame. She'd been driving for 3 days straight. No sleep, no food after the first morning. Just the relentless sun, the endless stretch of Colorado dust, and the sound of her own breathing, ragged, uneven, like something inside her chest had come loose and wouldn't settle back into place. Behind her, in the wagon bed, was everything she owned: a trunk of clothes, a quilt her mother had sewn, a cast-iron skillet, and a leather satchel containing $42 and a letter she couldn't bring herself to burn. The letter was from the town council of Silver Pine. It was short, efficient, brutal. Mrs. Winslow, due to recent events and the moral standing of this community, your presence is no longer welcome. You are hereby advised to vacate the premises within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in legal action. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. They hadn't named what she'd done. They didn't have to. Everyone in Silver Pine knew. Everyone had seen the way Daniel Corbin looked at her in the weeks after her husband died. Everyone had heard the rumors, started by his wife, spread by the preacher, confirmed by silence. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It didn't matter that Clara had never so much as touched Daniel Corbin's hand. What mattered was that his wife believed it. And when a woman like Margaret Corbin believed something, the whole town followed. So Clara had packed her wagon in the dead of night, left the little house she'd shared with Thomas for 6 years, and driven west with no destination in mind. Just away, anywhere that wasn't Silver Pine. Now, 3 days later, she was here, wherever here was. The land stretched out in every direction, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, a line of cottonwoods marking a distant creek and far to the north, the jagged peaks of the Rockies cutting into the sky like broken teeth, and in the middle of it all, about a quarter-mile ahead, was a ranch, not a big one. Just a low-slung cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that looked like it had been patched 100 times, and a corral where a few horses stood flicking their tails against the flies. Clara stared at it for a long time. She didn't know who lived there. Didn't know if they'd help her or turn her away. Didn't even know if she had the strength left to ask. But the sun was sinking fast and the nights out here were cold enough to kill. She clicked her tongue. The mule didn't move. "Come on," she whispered. Her voice cracked. Please, the mule took one step, then another. Slow, reluctant, but forward. Clara's vision blurred. She blinked hard, forced herself to sit straighter, and kept the reins loose in her hands as the wagon creaked toward the ranch. By the time she reached the yard, the sky had gone purple at the edges. A man stood on the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a hat pulled low enough that she couldn't see his face. He didn't move as she pulled the wagon to a stop 20 feet away. Just stood there, one hand resting on the porch rail, watching. Clara's throat closed up. She climbed down from the wagon, too fast, too clumsy, and her legs nearly buckled when her boots hit the ground. She caught herself on the wheel, steadied, and forced herself to look up. The man still hadn't moved. Clara's voice came out thin and brittle. She swallowed, tried again. "I'm sorry to trouble you. I don't mean to impose. She stopped. The words tangled in her mouth, and suddenly all she could feel was the weight of the last 72 hours pressing down on her like a landslide. The man tilted his head slightly. "You lost?" "No." The word came out too fast. Then quieter. "Yes." He was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped down from the porch, and for the first time, Clara could see his face. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, maybe more, with a weathered face and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and stopped being surprised by any of it. His jaw was shadowed with a few days' worth of stubble, and there was a scar running along his left temple, faint but unmistakable. He looked her over, not in the way men usually did, but like he was taking inventory. "The mule, the wagon, the trunk, her. You running from something?" he asked. Clara's breath hitched. "I'm not a criminal." "Didn't say you were. I'm not." She stopped herself, bit down on the words before they could spill out. "I just need a place to rest. 1 night. Maybe 2. I can pay." The man's gaze flicked to the wagon again, then back to her. How much you got? $42, he didn't react. Just nodded once, slow, like he was turning something over in his mind. Then he said, "You can stay." Clara blinked. "What? You can stay," he repeated. His voice was flat, matter of fact, like he was telling her the weather. "Barn's dry. There's hay in the loft. You can sleep there tonight." For a moment, Clara couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. Then her knees gave out. She dropped to the ground, hard, sudden, and the sob that tore out of her chest was so raw it didn't even sound human. The man didn't move. Didn't reach for her. Just stood there, hat in hand now, watching as Clara Winslow folded in on herself and wept into the dust. When she finally looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt, he was still standing there. "Name's Holt," he said quietly. "Holt Brennan." Clara nodded, unable to form words. Holt turned and walked toward the barn. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "Before it gets dark." Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay in the hayloft with her quilt pulled up to her chin, staring at the barn roof and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. The horses shifted in their stalls below. The wind rattled the boards. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. And downstairs, just outside the barn door, Holt Brennan sat on an overturned crate, smoking a cigarette. She could see the faint glow of it through the gaps in the floorboards. He hadn't asked her any more questions, hadn't pressed her for details or demanded explanations. He'd just shown her to the loft, told her where the water pump was, and left. Clara didn't know what to make of him. Men like Holt didn't just let strange women stay on their land. Not without a reason, not without expecting something in return. But when she'd looked into his eyes earlier, all she'd seen was tired, not cruel, not calculating, just tired. Like he'd made too many hard choices and stopped caring what people thought about them. By dawn, Clara was awake and dressed. She climbed down from the loft, smoothed her skirt, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. Holt was already up. He stood by the corral, leaning against the fence with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He glanced at her as she approached, but didn't say anything. Clara stopped a few feet away. "Thank you," she said. "For last night." Holt nodded once. "You leaving today?" She hesitated. I don't know." He took a sip of coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You got somewhere to go?" "No." The word hung in the air between them. Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know how to work?" Clara blinked. "What?" "Cook, clean, mend, any of that?" "Yes," she said slowly. "I can do all of that." Holt nodded again, like he'd expected as much. "Then you can stay longer. If you want." Clara's heart stuttered. "Stay? Here?" "Work for it," Holt said. "I don't need charity, and I'm guessing you don't want it. You cook, keep the place in order, and I'll give you a roof. Fair trade." Clara stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Holt finally looked at her. His eyes were unreadable. "Because I got more space than I need," he said simply. "And you look like you don't have any." For 3 days Clara worked. She swept the cabin, scrubbed the floors, mended Holt's shirts, cooked meals that were simple but warm. Beans, bacon, biscuits, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Holt didn't talk much. He worked from dawn to dusk, fixing fences, tending horses, hauling water, and when he came inside at night, he ate in silence, nodded his thanks, and disappeared into his room. It was the strangest arrangement Clara had ever been part of, but it was also the first time in months she'd felt like she could breathe. On the 4th morning, a rider appeared on the horizon. Clara saw him first. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she caught the movement. A dark shape cutting across the plains. Heading straight for the ranch, her stomach dropped. She turned and ran to the barn, where Holt was shoeing one of the horses. "Someone's coming," she said, breathless. Holt looked up. He didn't seem surprised. Just set down the horse's hoof, straightened, and walked to the barn door. The rider was closer now. Clara could make out the details, a man in a dark coat, a wide-brimmed hat, a rifle slung across his back. "You know him?" Clara asked. Holt's jaw tightened. "Yeah, who is he?" Holt didn't answer. He just stepped out into the yard and waited. The rider pulled up in front of the cabin and dismounted. He was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 30, with a clean-shaven face and eyes that looked too sharp for comfort. "Holt," the man said, tipping his hat. "Marshall," Holt replied evenly. Clara's blood went cold. The marshal's gaze shifted to her, lingering just long enough to make her skin crawl. Then he looked back at Holt. "Heard you got a new hand," the marshal said. "Word travels fast," Holt said. "It does when people start asking questions." Holt folded his arms. "What kind of questions?" The marshal smiled, thin, humorless. "The kind that come from Silverpine." Clara's knees went weak. The marshal pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up. "Got a letter from the town council. Says a woman left under questionable circumstances. Says she might be dangerous." "Dangerous," Holt repeated flatly. "That's what they say." Holt glanced at Clara. She stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then Holt looked back at the marshal. "She's not dangerous. You sure about that?" "Yeah." The marshal studied him for a long moment. Then he tucked the letter back into his coat. "People are going to talk, Holt, you know that." "Let them." The marshal's smile faded. "This isn't just talk. You're harboring a woman with a reputation. That makes you complicit." Holt's expression didn't change. "She's staying." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "You willing to stake your name on that?" "I already did." For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. Then the marshal mounted his horse, tipped his hat one last time, and rode off. Clara didn't move until he was out of sight. Then she turned to Holt, her voice shaking. "You didn't have to do that," Holt shrugged. "Yeah, I did. Why?" He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. "Because," he said quietly, "you didn't deserve what they did to you." Clara's throat closed up. She nodded once, unable to speak, and turned away before the tears could fall. Behind her, Holt picked up his hammer and went back to work. The marshal's visit changed everything. For 2 weeks, the ranch was quiet. Clara cooked. Holt worked. Neither of them spoke much about what had happened, but the weight of it hung in the air like smoke. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the first rumor arrived. A supply wagon rolled up to the ranch just after dawn. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete who made the rounds to the outlying homesteads, unloaded Holt's order of flour, salt, and nails, then lingered by the wagon longer than usual. "Heard something in town," Pete said, his voice low. Holt glanced up from where he was stacking the supplies. "Yeah?" "About the woman." Pete jerked his chin toward the cabin where Clara was inside kneading dough. "People are saying she's trouble. That she ran off with another man's money. That she didn't," Holt said flatly. Pete held up his hands. "I'm just telling you what I heard." "Then stop hearing it." Pete hesitated, then nodded and climbed back onto his wagon. But as he drove off, Clara watched from the window, and she could see the way he glanced back over his shoulder, like he was already planning who to tell next. The second rumor came 3 days later. This time, it was a pair of ranch hands from a neighboring spread. They stopped by under the pretense of asking if Holt had any spare horseshoes. But Clara could see the way their eyes tracked her as she crossed the yard with a basket of laundry. One of them, a younger man with a cocky grin, leaned against the corral fence and said, "That the widow from Silverpine?" Holt didn't look up from the fence post he was hammering. "That's none of your business." "Just curious," the man said. "Heard she's the reason Daniel Corbin's marriage went south." Holt's hammer stopped mid-swing. He straightened, turned, and looked the man dead in the eye. "You heard wrong," Holt said. The man's grin faltered. "I'm just saying." "Then stop saying it." The two ranch hands exchanged a glance. Then they mounted their horses and left without another word. Clara stood on the porch, clutching the laundry basket so hard her hands ached. When Holt walked past her into the cabin, she followed him. "They're not going to stop," she said quietly. Holt poured himself a cup of coffee, his back to her. "I know. People are going to keep talking. They're going to make it worse. Let them." Clara's voice cracked. "Holt, you don't understand. This is what they did in Silverpine. It started with whispers. Then it was letters. Then it was the council telling me to leave. It doesn't stop." Holt turned to face her. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady. "You want to leave?" Clara opened her mouth, closed it. The truth was she didn't know. She'd been here for 3 weeks now, and it was the first place since Thomas died that had felt even remotely like safety. But safety was a fragile thing, and she'd already seen it shatter once. "I don't want to ruin you," she whispered. Holt set down his cup. "You won't? You don't know that?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do." The third rumor came with fire. It was a week later, just past midnight. When Clara woke to the smell of smoke, she bolted upright in the loft, her heart hammering, and scrambled to the edge to look down. The barn door was open. Orange light flickered outside. "Holt!" She screamed. She didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed her boots, shoved them on, and climbed down the ladder so fast she nearly fell. Outside, the night was alive with chaos. The corral was on fire. Not the whole thing, just the far side, where someone had piled dry brush and hay against the fence posts and set it ablaze. The flames licked upward, crackling and spitting, and the horses inside were screaming. Holt was already there, shirtless, hauling buckets of water from the pump and hurling them at the flames. His face was streaked with soot, his arms shaking with effort. Clara ran to the pump, filled another bucket, and staggered toward the fire. "Get back!" Holt shouted. "I'm helping." "Clara!" She threw the water at the base of the flames. It hissed and sputtered but didn't go out. They worked in tandem, bucket after bucket, until Clara's arms felt like they were going to tear off and her lungs burned from the smoke. The horses screamed. The fire roared. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the light, Clara swore she heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. It took an hour to put the fire out. When it was finally done, Holt sank to his knees in the dirt, chest heaving, and stared at the blackened remains of the corral fence. Clara stood a few feet away, trembling. "They did this because of me," she said. Holt didn't answer. "Holt, I know," he said quietly. Clara's voice broke. "I should leave." Holt looked up at her. His face was smudged with ash, his eyes red-rimmed from the smoke. "You think that'll stop them?" "Maybe. It won't," Holt said. "People like that don't stop. They just find someone else to burn." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the lingering heat of the fire. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. Holt pushed himself to his feet, wincing. "We rebuild the fence," he said. "And we don't give them the satisfaction of running." He walked past her toward the cabin, limping slightly, and Clara stood alone in the smoldering yard. Watching the embers die, they rebuilt the fence in silence. It took 3 days. Holt worked from dawn to dusk, hauling new posts, hammering rails, and replacing the charred sections of wood. Clara helped where she could, holding boards steady, passing tools, bringing water when he looked like he was about to collapse. They didn't talk about the fire, didn't talk about who'd set it or why, but the question hung between them, heavy and unanswered. On the third evening, as the sun dipped low and the new fence stood solid and straight, Holt finally stopped working. He leaned against the corral rail, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and stared out at the horizon. Clara stood a few feet away, her hands raw and blistered, watching him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Holt didn't look at her. "Doing what?" "This, all of it. Letting me stay. Defending me, rebuilding." She paused. "You don't owe me anything." Holt was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I had a wife once." Clara blinked. "You did?" "Yeah." His voice was flat, but there was something underneath it, something sharp and broken. "Her name was Emma. She died 6 years ago." "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. Holt shook his head. "She didn't die of sickness. She died because people in town decided she wasn't worth saving." Clara went still. "There was a drought," Holt continued. "Bad one. The well ran dry and we had to haul water from the creek 2 miles out. Emma went one day while I was working. Wagon tipped. Broke her leg. She called for help, but nobody came." His jaw tightened. "They heard her." "I know they did. But she was different, didn't fit in. Didn't go to church. Didn't smile the right way. So they left her there." Clara's throat closed up. "Holt, I found her 3 hours later," he said quietly. "She was still alive. But the leg got infected. She was gone a week after that." He finally looked at Clara, and his eyes were raw. "So yeah, I know what it's like when people decide you're not worth their mercy." Clara couldn't speak. Couldn't move. All she could do was stand there, her heart breaking for a man she barely knew. Holt pushed off the fence and started walking toward the cabin. "That's why you can stay," he said over his shoulder. "For as long as you need." That night, Clara couldn't sleep again. She lay in the loft, staring at the ceiling, replaying Holt's words in her mind. She thought about Emma, about Thomas, about all the ways people could be cruel without ever lifting a hand. And she thought about Holt, this quiet, broken man who'd chosen to stand between her and the fire. even when it would have been easier to let her go. She didn't know what she'd done to deserve that kind of loyalty, but she knew she couldn't take it for granted. The next morning, Clara found Holt sitting on the porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. She sat down beside him, folded her hands in her lap and said, "Thank you." Holt glanced at her. "For what?" "For telling me about Emma, for trusting me with that." Holt nodded slowly. Yeah, they sat in silence for a while. The sky turned from gold to blue and the ranch woke up around them. Then Clara said, "I had a husband too. His name was Thomas." Holt didn't say anything, just listened. "He was kind," Clara continued. "Gentle. He worked at the mill in Silver Pine. We didn't have much, but we were happy." She paused. "He died in an accident. Fell from a scaffolding. They said he didn't suffer, but I don't know if that's true." Holt's voice was quiet. "I'm sorry. After he died, I didn't know what to do. I tried to keep going, but people, they looked at me differently. Like I was bad luck? Like grief was contagious." She laughed bitterly. Then Daniel Corbin started coming around. He said he wanted to help. Brought firewood. Fixed the roof. His wife got jealous. Started telling people I was trying to steal him. And once that story got out, you couldn't stop it, Holt finished. "No," Clara whispered. "I couldn't." They sat in silence again, the weight of shared grief settling between them like an old friend. Finally, Holt said, "You're not bad luck, Clara." Clara's eyes stung. "You don't know that." "Yeah," Holt said quietly. "I do." He stood, drained the last of his coffee, and walked toward the barn. Clara stayed on the porch, watching him go, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. Section 5. Full resolution plus epilogue. The town came for them on a Sunday. Clara saw the dust first, a long, slow plume rising from the road to the east. She was in the garden pulling weeds when she looked up and saw it, her stomach clenched. "Holt," she called. He was in the barn. He stepped out, squinting at the horizon, and his face went hard. "How many?" Clara asked. "Too many. They came in a group, 10 riders, maybe more." Clara recognized a few faces from the supply runs. Others were strangers. But at the front, riding a gray mare, was the marshal. They pulled up in the yard and the marshal dismounted. Holt stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the cabin. Clara stood behind him, her hands trembling. "Holt," the marshal said. His tone was almost apologetic. "You know why we're here." "No," Holt said evenly. "Why don't you tell me?" The marshal sighed. "The town council's getting pressure. People are talking. They want the woman gone." "She's not leaving," Holt said. One of the other riders, a thick-necked man with a shotgun across his lap, spat into the dirt. "You're harboring a homewrecker, Brennan. That makes you complicit." "She's not a homewrecker," Holt said. "She's a widow who got run out of town by a bunch of cowards." The man's face darkened. "Watch your mouth, or what?" Holt took a step forward. "You'll burn another fence? Scare some horses? You think that makes you tough?" The marshal held up a hand. "Holt, don't make this harder than it has to be." "Then leave," Holt said. "Take your men and go." "She's staying." The marshal shook his head. "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because if I do, they'll come back. And next time it won't be the fence they burn." The words hung in the air like a noose. Clara's breath caught. She stepped forward, her voice shaking. "I'll go," Holt turned to her. "No." "I'll go," Clara repeated. "It's fine. I'll leave. No," Holt said again, louder this time. He looked back at the marshal. "She's staying. And if anyone's got a problem with that, they can take it up with me." The marshal studied him for a long moment. Then he said, "You're willing to die for her?" Holt didn't hesitate. "If that's what it takes." The yard went silent. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, uneasy. Another exchanged a glance with the man beside him. The marshal sighed, long and slow, and rubbed his face. "Holt, you're a damn fool." "Maybe," Holt said. "But I'm a fool who's not backing down." The marshal looked at the other riders. None of them moved. Then quietly, the marshal said, "Margaret Corbin's the one pushing this. You know that, right? She's the one who wrote the letters. She's the one who got the council involved." Holt's jaw tightened. "I figured. She's got influence, money, a husband who'll do whatever she says." So? The marshal shook his head. So you're making an enemy you can't afford. I've got plenty of those already, Holt said. One more won't kill me. For a moment, the marshal just stared at him. Then slowly he nodded. All right, he said. I'll tell the council you refuse to comply. But Holt, this doesn't end here. I know, Holt said. The marshal mounted his horse. The other riders followed suit. As they turned to leave, the marshal looked back one last time. Good luck, he said quietly. Then they rode off, and the dust settled, and Clara and Holt stood alone in the yard. Clara's legs gave out. She sank to the ground, her whole body shaking, and Holt crouched beside her. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Yeah, Holt said. I did. Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Why? Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Because you deserve a place to stand. Clara's chest heaved. She nodded, unable to speak, and Holt reached out and helped her to her feet. They stood there in the yard, side by side, and watched the sun sink toward the horizon. The ranch was different now. The garden was bigger. The cabin had a new coat of paint. The horses were sleek and healthy, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. And in the kitchen, Clara was kneading dough while Holt sat at the table, mending a bridle. They'd heard the rumors, of course. They always did. But the town had stopped sending riders, stopped sending letters. Margaret Corbin had moved on to some other scandal, and the marshal had made it clear he wasn't interested in doing her dirty work anymore. Life had settled into a rhythm, quiet, steady, unremarkable. And for the first time since Thomas died, Clara felt like she could breathe. You're smiling, Holt said. Glancing up from the bridle, Clara looked at him, surprised. I am. Yeah. She touched her face as if she didn't believe it. Then she laughed, soft, tentative, but real. I guess I am, she said. Holt's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Good, he said. Clara went back to the dough, her hands moving in steady, practiced motions. Outside, the wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Clara would remember that moment, standing in the kitchen, the smell of bread rising, Holt's quiet presence at the table, as the moment she stopped running. She would remember the way the light slanted through the window, golden warm, and the way the ranch felt less like a place she was hiding, and more like a place she belonged. She would remember Holt's voice the day he told her she could stay, and she would remember the way his hand had felt in hers the first time she reached for it, steady, solid, and sure. They never married. Never needed to. The ranch was theirs, the life was theirs, and that was enough. And when Clara was old and gray, sitting on the same porch where Holt had once told her she wasn't bad luck, she would close her eyes and see it all again. The dust, the fire, the riders, and Holt standing between her and the world, refusing to let her fall. The sun sets over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The cabin stands quiet and strong, smoke curling from the chimney. In the yard, two figures sit side by side on the porch, silhouetted against the fading light, watching the day end together. The land stretches out before them, vast, unbroken, and theirs,